April 1st, 1945. The island of Okinawa trembled as dawn broke. The beaches stretched wide and desolate, a thin curtain of mist rolling over the reefs. From the sea came a roar unlike anything the Pacific had yet endured. Thousands of American warships lined the horizon, their silhouettes black against the rising sun. Gun barrels turned slowly, like the watchful eyes of giants, their thunder shaking the coral bedrock with each volley. Yet it was not the guns that astonished the people of Okinawa, it was what followed. As the Marines pressed inland, as the Army divisions carved their way across villages and hillsides, the narrow roads of the island became rivers of steel and rubber. Convoys stretched for miles, moving ceaselessly, as if some endless artery of war had been laid upon the soil. Japanese civilians, pressed into hiding, peered from shattered windows and torn rice fields. And they saw something beyond comprehension: American trucks. Tens of thousands of them, streaming endlessly, carrying supplies, men, and the promise of relentless advance. The air smelled of cordite and burning timber. But mingled within it was another scent: oil and gasoline, sharp and foreign. The rumble of engines was constant, a mechanical thunder that filled valleys and drowned the cries of the displaced. For the Okinawan farmer who had once led oxen down those same dirt paths, the sight was alien. Where once a lone cart creaked under the weight of rice or sugarcane, now endless convoys rolled by. GMC 2.5-ton trucks, Dodge WC utility vehicles, and Studebaker six-wheelers, all painted in the dull olive drab of an empire that seemed to manufacture war as easily as it breathed. Children hid behind their mothers' kimonos, their eyes wide, watching the procession of machines. Old men whispered prayers to ancestors, struggling to understand the scale of this invasion not only in guns and ships, but also in wheels and axles, and in headlights that burned through the night like unblinking eyes. The Japanese defenders, hardened soldiers of the Imperial Army, had expected the sea of ships. They had braced themselves for the storm of steel that rained from naval batteries. They had dug their caves into the limestone ridges, waiting to fight to the death. But what they had not fully anticipated was the machinery of American logistics. Trucks rolled off landing craft as if spat out by some great industrial furnace back in Detroit, Chicago, or Cleveland. Within hours of landing, roads were clogged with convoys moving ammunition, rations, medical supplies, barbed wire, and even prefabricated bridges. To the civilians who had known only ox carts and bicycles, the sight was overwhelming. An invasion not just of soldiers, but of an entire mechanical civilization on the ridges above. Japanese observers scribbled notes in disbelief. Through their field glasses, they saw not only tanks and infantry, but also convoys stretching back to the beaches, a tide of mobility that never seemed to end. Reports were sent to headquarters describing a rolling factory line on wheels, an enemy that appeared capable of creating new armies every single day. One officer muttered that the Americans fought not as men alone, but as men fused with their machines, a war powered by engines as much as by blood. The roads of Okinawa became arteries of conquest. Dust rose in sheets behind the convoys, coating the island's lush fields in a thin gray mask. Every bend, every incline groaned beneath the weight of Detroit steel. Soldiers sat in the back of trucks, their rifles slung, faces smeared with salt and grime, eyes hollow yet determined. For them, the trucks were lifelines. They carried more than supplies, they carried survival. Ammunition belts for Browning machine guns, crates of grenades, rations in khaki-colored tins marked U.S. Army, drums off water, and plasma bags for the wounded. The trucks carried the war forward 1 mile at a time, grinding over coral, mud, and shattered villages. For the civilians, caught in the path of this endless tide, the experience was surreal. Families clutched what little they could carry, pressed against walls as convoys thundered by. The trucks seemed alive, like an army of beasts breathing through mufflers and radiators, belching smoke and heat. The ground trembled as they passed, and the children who had once known only the chirp of cicadas and the rustle of bamboo now knew the relentless growl of engines. They whispered that the trucks had no end, that the Americans brought more in a day than Japan could summon in a year. Night fell, but the convoys did not stop. Headlights pierced the darkness, stretching across hillsides in unbroken lines of light. It was a sight both mesmerizing and terrifying, as if the very stars had descended to Earth and marched in columns across the island. Japanese commanders, huddled in underground chambers, studied maps lit by lanterns. They knew the truth. Every truck on those roads meant another day their defenses would be worn down, another night where the Americans would not starve, would not break. Their soldiers, by contrast, carried what they could on their backs. They moved silently, with no engines to carry them, dragging artillery by hand, rationing bullets and rice balls. To them, the endless rumble of American convoys was not just noise. It was doom itself, grinding closer each hour. And so Okinawa, the last great island before Japan itself, became the theater of contrasts. On one side, the silence of defenders who dug into caves, resigned to death with dwindling supplies. On the other, the endless roar of American engines, a sound that promised not only invasion but endurance, a war machine that would not run dry. Civilians caught between the two saw it all. They watched their homes consumed by fire, their fields turned into highways off-war, and their ancient villages drowned beneath waves of steel. They could not comprehend the factories that birthed these convoys thousands of miles away, but they could feel their power as the earth shook beneath each passing wheel. April turned to May. Rain fell, and the trucks did not stop. Mud swallowed the roads, but American engineers laid steel mats, built bridges, and carved new paths through hillsides. Still the convoys rolled. Civilians waded through flooded paddies, clutching their children as headlights reflected in the water like twin moons. Soldiers crouched in caves, listening as the growl of engines echoed through the night. Constant, unyielding by June, the civilians had no illusions left. They whispered to each other. America was not just an army. It was an entire nation brought to the island. Its power measured not only in guns but in wheels and gasoline, in endless convoys that turned dirt paths into highways of conquest. For them, the war was no longer a clash of men alone. It was a clash of civilizations, and the trucks that filled the roads of Okinawa were its clearest, loudest proof by the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most brutal stage. The Japanese Empire, once stretching from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Central Pacific, was collapsing under the relentless weight of American industry and strategy. Iwo Jima had fallen after a month of slaughter. The Philippines had been retaken in a campaign that crippled Japan's ability to project power southward. And now, the eyes of both armies turned to Okinawa, the keystone of the Pacific, the last barrier before the home islands themselves. For the Japanese, Okinawa was not just another battlefield. It was the final line of defense, the place where they would bleed the Americans so heavily that the invasion of Japan proper might be reconsidered. Here, on an island only 60 miles long, they dug in 100,000 soldiers, supported by local militias, and ordered them to fight to the death. They fortified ridges and hillsides, carving tunnels into the limestone and building underground bunkers and artillery chambers. Every inch of ground would be defended, every road turned into a killing zone. For the Americans, the invasion of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was both a necessity and a nightmare. The island lay only 350 miles from Kyushu, while within bomber range of Japan's cities. Possession of Okinawa meant airfields for B-29s, naval bases for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and staging grounds for the invasion of the Japanese mainland. Yet commanders knew the price would be staggering. Naval intelligence predicted kamikaze swarms of unprecedented ferocity. The Army and Marine Corps expected to fight, not just soldiers, but also civilians conscripted into suicide squads. April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, saw the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War unfold. More than 1,300 ships carried the U.S. 10th Army, over 180,000 troops, toward Okinawa's shores. The bombardment before the landing dwarfed even Normandy, raining steel upon the island for days. Villages were reduced to dust, ridgelines gouged into raw earth. The defenders sheltered deep underground, waiting for the inevitable push inland. When the Americans came ashore, they found little resistance at first. Beaches were secured with relative ease, a deceptive calm that unsettled veterans who knew the Japanese rarely yielded ground without a fight. But the true defense lay inland, where the ridges of Shuri awaited, bristling with hidden bunkers, artillery, and fields of fire. The Japanese strategy was deliberate: lure the invader in, then grind him down. Yet as the Americans advanced, they revealed their own strategy, one forged not in secrecy, but in sheer industrial might. Unlike their enemy, who clung desperately to supply lines stretched across a starving empire, the Americans brought everything with them. Where the Japanese relied on caves and caches, the Americans relied on convoys. Trucks roared onto the beaches within hours, disgorged from landing ships in endless streams. Supplies were unloaded with mechanical precision, stacked high in makeshift depots that rose like fortresses behind the lines. This was the starkest contrast of all: one army prepared to die in place, another prepared to build a war machine in motion. The civilians of Okinawa, trapped between these titans, could see it with their own eyes. They watched as Japanese soldiers scavenged food, hauling crates by hand and dragging artillery with ropes. Then they turned their gaze toward the Americans, who seemed to summon entire cities from the sea. Roads filled with trucks, each one a symbol of a nation's industrial heartbeat, pulsing across an island thousands of miles from its homeland. The wider war had set the stage for this imbalance. By 1945, Japan's shipping lanes were shattered, its navy crippled, and its factories reduced to rubble under the relentless assault of B-29 superfortresses. The Imperial Army still fought with ferocity, but its lifeblood was drying up. Fuel was scarce, ammunition was rationed, and replacements were nearly impossible. Civilians were conscripted not because Japan wanted them to fight, but because there was simply no one left. America, by contrast, had reached the peak of its war production. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles churned out weapons and vehicles at a pace the world had never seen. The Liberty shipyards on the West Coast launched vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. The assembly lines of Chrysler and General Motors turned out trucks, tanks, and jeeps by the tens of thousands. For every rifleman on Okinawa, there were dozens of laborers back home ensuring he would not run short of food, ammunition, or gasoline. The Japanese high command understood this imbalance, yet hoped to counter it with willpower and sacrifice. Kamikaze pilots hurled themselves against American fleets, sinking dozens of ships in the process. Suicide squads attacked tanks with explosives strapped to their chests. Soldiers in caves fought until flames consumed them. But for every Japanese life spent, the Americans answered with another shipment, another convoy, another mile of road filled with machines. Civilians bore the brunt of this clash. Okinawan families were ordered by Japanese officers to support the war effort, to surrender their food, their tools, and even their sons. Many resisted, terrified of both armies, unsure whom to fear more. When the Americans advanced, they carried loudspeakers, promising safety, but the civilians had been told by their occupiers that capture meant torture and death. Torn between lies and hope, many watched silently as the war unfolded in front of them, powerless to stop it. The context of Okinawa was therefore more than just a battle. It was the culmination of two visions of war colliding. On one side, a Japan willing to sacrifice its last reserves of blood and spirit. On the other, an America willing to unleash the full measure of its industrial might. Trucks filled the roads of Okinawa not by accident, but by design, a design that reflected a doctrine built on mobility, logistics, and the belief that wars are won not only with bullets, but with the endless supply of them. By the time Okinawa was fully engulfed in combat, the civilians knew they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. The Japanese soldiers spoke of honor and death. The Americans spoke little, but their machines spoke for them. For the people of Okinawa, it was a vision of two worlds colliding, one clinging desperately to the past, the other driving relentlessly into the future on wheels that seemed never to stop. Turning, the shock of Okinawa lay not only in the thunder of naval guns or the shrieking dive of kamikazes, it lay in something quieter, something relentless. The secret advantage the Americans brought ashore was not hidden in a single weapon, but in the orchestration of an entire system. To the Japanese defenders, the battle became a grim puzzle. How could an army so far from home fight as though it were still in its own backyard? How did they summon supplies without end, fuel without exhaustion, and food without famine? The answer rumbled past in convoys of olive-drab trucks and in the doctrine that powered them. The Japanese had long prided themselves on the warrior spirit, on sacrifice and ferocity. They were veterans of campaigns in China, Burma, and the Philippines, where mobility meant marching on foot, hauling artillery with oxen, and relying on railroads vulnerable to sabotage. Their officers believed willpower could compensate for shortages and that courage could overcome scarcity. But on Okinawa, this philosophy collided with a new kind of war, one that was mechanical, industrial, and systematic. The Americans had mastered logistics as a weapon. The doctrine of supply was not an afterthought, but a cornerstone. Every rifleman depended on a chain that stretched back across the Pacific, and that chain was forged of trucks. The Deuce and a half, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, was the backbone. In Europe, it had carried armies from Normandy to the Rhine. Now, it rolled across Okinawa's narrow roads, bridging the gap between beaches and battlefront. Thousands of them, in endless procession, ensured that American units never lacked what they needed most: food, ammunition, and mobility. To the civilians watching from shattered farmhouses, it was bewildering. These trucks seemed to appear from nowhere, disgorged from the belly of ships, rolling down ramps as though conjured from some mechanical forge across the sea. They carried crates stacked higher than a man, bullets, mortar shells, and bazooka rockets. Others carried rations in cans marked Spam and Rations, food that could be eaten cold, carried easily, and distributed fast. Japanese soldiers scavenged for scraps, boiling weeds into soup, while Americans ate hot meals delivered in insulated containers. The difference was staggering. For the defenders, the disparity bred despair. Reports filtered back to headquarters describing the enemy's iron rivers. One officer lamented that each American soldier seemed to fight with an entire factory behind him, while his own men dug with bare hands. Another wrote bitterly that the enemy fought with moving warehouses, while Japanese units clung to rice balls and bamboo spears. Even when American advances slowed under fierce resistance, the convoys did not stop. Trucks rolled past burning villages, past lines of wounded carried back on stretchers, past artillery thundering in the hills. They fed the front like arteries feeding a heart. The secret was not merely numbers, but communication. Radios crackled along the routes, guiding convoys, rerouting them when roads were blocked, and coordinating deliveries with clockwork precision. A single American commander could redirect supplies to a regiment miles away with the push of a button. Japanese units, by contrast, relied on runners or wired telephones that snapped under bombardment. Orders took hours, sometimes days, to reach the front. In that time, the battle had already shifted, and the Americans had already reinforced. The trucks also carried something less tangible, but equally devastating: confidence. Soldiers riding in the back of a GMC could look around and see stacks of crates, barrels of fuel, and even mail from home. They knew they would eat that night and knew they would have bullets, toe fire, and bandages if they bled. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, marched hungry, often cut off, surrounded not only by enemies but also by the creeping knowledge that their homeland could no longer sustain them. For the civilians, the sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. They had been told by their occupiers that America was weak, decadent, and incapable of enduring hardship. Yet what they saw was an invader who seemed inexhaustible, whose strength did not waver even as the days turned into weeks. Some whispered that the trucks themselves were weapons, that America's true secret was not its soldiers, but its ability to make the island itself bow beneath the weight of its industry. And indeed, the Japanese high command, buried deep within the caves of Shuri, began to realize the truth. They could kill thousands of Americans, sink ships with kamikazes, and destroy tanks with ambushes, but they could not stop the trucks. Every day more arrived. Every night, headlights pierced the dark, an unbroken chain of supply. It was as if the American war machine had wrapped its arms around the island, squeezing tighter with each passing mile. This was the hidden advantage, invisible to the untrained, yet obvious to those who listened to the roads at night. It was not glory, not bravery, not even firepower alone. It was the quiet, unyielding thunder of wheels turning, of engines growling, of convoys stretching farther than the horizon. an advantage not born of battlefield heroics, but of planning, industry, and the conviction that wars are won not only by men with rifles, but by the trucks that carry their lifeblood forward. For the Okinawan farmer watching from the edge of a rice paddy, the lesson was stark. Japan's soldiers fought with courage, but courage alone could not fill empty stomachs. America's soldiers fought with confidence, because behind every one of them rumbled a truck. And behind that truck stretched a nation of factories, shipyards, and workers who never set foot on Okinawa, yet shaped its fate. The civilians could see it plainly. The Americans were not merely here to fight. They were here to endure. And endurance meant victory. The trucks themselves became characters in the drama of Okinawa. Machines with souls forged in steel, pistons, and grease. To understand their role is to step into the heart of American industrial genius, where engineering was married to doctrine, and doctrine to victory. At the center stood the GMC CCKW, the Deuce and a half, named for its 2.5-ton carrying capacity. It weighed nearly 5 tons when loaded, with a 6-wheel drive system that clawed over mud, coral, and shattered roads. Its 270 cubic inch engine delivered 91 horsepower, modest by modern standards, but unstoppable when multiplied across hundreds of thousands of units. In total, more than 500,000 were produced during the war, each rolling off assembly lines in Detroit and Pontiac with the same uniform olive drab coat and the same promise of reliability. Alongside them came the Dodge WC series, smaller but no less vital. These utility trucks ferried squads of soldiers, medical teams, and signal corpsmen with their radios. They were light, agile, and quick to repair, designed to weave between convoys and carry messages through the chaos of battle. The Studebaker US-6, meanwhile, found its place hauling heavy equipment, bridging units, and artillery. Its broad tires dug into the wet clay of Okinawa's hillsides, dragging tons of steel up slopes where men alone would have faltered. Each truck had its role, each a cog in the larger machine of war. The engineering was deliberate and meticulous. The GMC's frame was built for modularity. Benches could be folded down to carry men, removed to carry crates, or fitted with racks to carry fuel drums. Its cargo bed became a chameleon, one day delivering rations, the next hauling wounded, the next carrying mortar shells to the front line. The Americans had designed not just a vehicle, but a system, a platform capable of adapting to the unpredictable rhythm of war. Inside, the trucks hummed with practical design. A 5-speed transmission gave drivers the torque to climb Okinawa's ridges. The suspension absorbed shocks from corrugated roads. The fuel tanks, designed for rapid refueling, ensured minimal downtime. Mechanics could replace parts in hours, not days, because every piece was standardized. In a war where delay meant death, this was as vital as firepower. Contrast this with the Japanese Fugo system, their attempt at logistical mobility. The Imperial Army relied heavily on animal transport and human porters, dragging carts through jungle mud, straining their bodies against the weight of artillery. Their few trucks were outdated, their parts scarce, and their fuel rationed. Factories in Japan struggled to keep up, bombed relentlessly by American B-29s. Where the Americans could call upon thousands of vehicles, the Japanese could only field a handful. Every breakdown was a disaster. Every missing part, a permanent loss. But the true brilliance of American trucking lay not only in the machines themselves, but also in the system that sustained them. Behind every convoy was an orchestra of planners, quartermasters, and signal officers. Radios like the SCR 508 crackled constantly, coordinating movement. Maps were marked with supply routes, carefully timed to avoid bottlenecks. Military police directed traffic at intersections, turning the chaos of thousands of vehicles into something resembling order. It was the highway of war, and it moved with precision. The sheer numbers astounded observers. In Europe, the Red Ball Express had become legend. 23,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily across France. On Okinawa, the scale was smaller but no less impressive, adjusted for the island's narrow roads and treacherous terrain. American engineers widened paths, built culverts, and laid steel matting to prevent trucks from sinking in mud. Convoys were timed to the minute, ensuring that ammunition reached the front as battles raged, and that the wounded were evacuated before their lifeblood drained away. and the factories back home fed this beast without pause. In Detroit, lines of workers, men, women, immigrants, tightened bolts, riveted panels, and checked engines. Every 23 minutes, another truck rolled off the line, bound eventually for Europe or the Pacific. The war had turned the United States into an assembly line of victory, and Okinawa was one of its final proving grounds. Japanese reports captured the despair this caused. A diary recovered from a fallen officer spoke of an enemy who fights with roads of iron, whose strength is multiplied by endless wagons of steel. Civilians whispered their own descriptions, comparing the convoys to dragons winding endlessly across the hills. To them, the technical details were incomprehensible, but the effect was undeniable. Each truck represented more than engineering. It represented mobility, adaptability, and inevitability. Tanks could break, planes could fall, and ships could sink. But the trucks endured. They could not be shot down from the sky and could not be torpedoed beneath the waves. They multiplied, swarming across the island until even the most remote hamlet felt the rumble of engines. The Americans knew this, too. They did not worship the machines, but they trusted them. A soldier with an empty canteen trusted that a truck would bring water. A wounded Marine trusted that a truck would carry him back to the aid station. A company commander trusted that ammunition would arrive before the next assault. In war, trust was rare. Yet in those olive-drab vehicles, an entire army placed its faith. For the Okinawan civilians, the engineering marvel was not in horsepower or transmissions, but in endurance. Day after day, the trucks rolled past, never ceasing, never failing. They became as much a part of the landscape as the ridges and caves, as constant as the monsoon rains. And for the Japanese defenders, each passing convoy was another reminder of what they lacked, not only the machines, but also the system, the vision, and the industry that made such machines possible. September 14th, 1944, had already taught the Germans in Europe the meaning of American mobility at Aracourt, where armored divisions seemed to appear and vanish on command, supplied by trucks that never slept. But on Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the lesson was repeated with ferocity on the other side of the world. The first major clashes around the Shuri line brought the truth into sharp focus. Logistics was the blade that cut deepest. At Kakaza Ridge, on April 8th, American forces struck against an entrenched Japanese defense. Mortars and machine guns raked the advancing Marines, pinning them down on exposed slopes. Ammunition belts ran empty, and grenades dwindled. In a traditional campaign, this might have spelled disaster, but the Americans had prepared for such inevitabilities. Within hours, convoys of trucks were threading through valleys, delivering crates of .30 caliber ammunition, fresh mortar shells, and satchels of explosives. Engineers carved detours through orchards, while military police redirected convoys around shell-cratered roads. The battle line held, then pushed forward again, fueled by the ceaseless lifeblood carried on wheels. Japanese soldiers observed this with disbelief. Their own supplies moved on human backs, creeping through tunnels or across fields under cover of night. One captured officer admitted under interrogation that his men had been ordered to survive on a handful of rice balls per day, while the Americans seemed to receive fresh food and ammunition even under heavy fire. The comparison ate away at morale. Every burst of gunfire from American rifles was not just a threat. It was a reminder that behind those bullets rolled convoys that would never stop coming. The civilians, too, saw the disparity. Villagers sheltering in caves watched at night as American headlights wound across the hillsides. The lights seemed endless, a procession that never faltered, even under shell fire. Children whispered that the trucks were like spirits, unkillable, unending. Farmers accustomed to seeing 1 or 2 oxen carts in a week now saw dozens of machines in an hour, each loaded with weapons of war. The island's dirt paths had transformed into arteries of steel, pulsing with American strength. Perhaps the clearest demonstration came during the push against Sugar Loaf Hill in May 1945. For 12 days, the Marines battered against the small rise, a hill barely 50 feet high yet fortified into a death trap. The Japanese rained grenades and mortars down the slopes, repelling assault after assault. Casualties mounted in horrifying numbers. Yet each morning, fresh supplies arrived by truck: bandages, plasma, stretchers for the wounded, crates of grenades, belts of machine gun ammunition, and flamethrower fuel. Trucks unloaded at forward dumps, sometimes under fire, their drivers leaping into ditches as shells whistled overhead. Still, they came back the next night, headlights blacked out, engines muted, carrying another load forward. The Japanese defenders were trapped in an opposite reality. Their lines grew weaker with each passing day. Ammunition rationing became severe. Mortar crews fired only when targets were certain. Artillerymen counted shells like coins, each one precious and irreplaceable. When convoys of oxen carts tried to reach the front, American air patrols shredded them with strafing fire. By the time Sugar Loaf Hill finally fell, the defenders had been reduced to desperation, their caves echoing with empty chambers. The Americans, battered but supplied, could replace what they lost. The Japanese could not. One Okinawan woman later recalled the sensation of hearing trucks more than guns. The guns came and went, she said, but the trucks never stopped. Even when the night was quiet, the earth still trembled with their passing. For her and countless others, the convoys became the soundtrack of invasion, a constant reminder that America's strength lay not only in its soldiers but also in its ability to sustain them. The Battle of Shuri Castle, the linchpin of the Japanese defense, drove this point to its climax. For weeks, American forces hammered at the fortified ridges, losing thousands of men. Rain turned roads into rivers of mud, yet still the trucks rolled. Engineers worked around the clock, laying corduroy roads from felled palm trees, bridging gullies with prefabricated spans, and installing steel matting so wheels could grip. Convoys pushed forward supplies to artillery that pounded the castle day and night. In late May, when the Japanese defense finally cracked, it was not only the shells and bombs that broke them, it was the realization that America's supply lines could not be broken, that their convoys were inexhaustible. German generals in Europe had once written with envy of America's mobility, noting that while their panzers were formidable, they starved without fuel. On Okinawa, Japanese commanders recorded the same despair. One diary entry found in a Shuri cave read simply, "The Americans fight with an unending stream of iron carts. We destroy some, but more always come. How can we fight a river?" The river swallowed Okinawa inch by inch. Villages burned, ridges collapsed under bombardment, and civilians watched the convoys stretch longer with each day. In the mud, in the rain, in the smoke of battle, the trucks never ceased. They carried not only supplies but also inevitability. And with each load they delivered, the defenders of Okinawa grew weaker, more isolated, and more certain that defeat was only a matter of time. The psychological war on Okinawa was fought not only with bullets and bombs, but also with perception. For the Japanese defenders, every passing convoy carried a message sharper than steel. You are outnumbered, outproduced, and outlasted. The roar of trucks became a sound of despair. Each engine was a prophecy of defeat, each load of supplies a reminder that the enemy's lifeblood flowed without end. Japanese doctrine had long emphasized the power of spirit. Soldiers were told that determination, sacrifice, and courage could triumph over material odds. On the ridges of Shuri, that belief was tested and shattered. A platoon that ran out of food, water, and ammunition could not fight with spirit alone. They watched Americans dig in with fresh rations, their canteens always full, their weapons always fed. For every Japanese soldier who starved, an American soldier received another hot meal from a mobile kitchen truck parked just behind the lines. The disparity spread like an infection. Officers struggled to inspire men who could hear, just beyond the ridges, the constant rumble of resupply. Soldiers whispered among themselves that the enemy fought with entire factories behind each rifle. Many went into battle already resigned, not because they lacked bravery, but because they knew their cause had become mathematically impossible. Civilians, too, felt the psychological weight. For generations, Okinawans had lived modest lives of farming and fishing, their days measured in harvests and tides. Now they lived in the shadow of a foreign army that seemed capable of building a new world overnight. Where the Japanese defenders begged for food, the Americans built depots stacked with crates taller than houses. Where villagers carried buckets of water from wells, the Americans pumped thousands of gallons from trucks in a single hour. For many, It seemed less like an army had landed and more like a civilization had descended at night. The convoys became lines of fire. Headlights cut through the darkness, stretching in twin beams across the hills. The sight crushed morale as surely as artillery barges. Japanese soldiers huddled in caves whispered that the Americans never slept, that their machines worked while men rested. The unbroken flow of light gave the illusion of endlessness, of an enemy whose strength could not be exhausted on the American side. The psychological effect was the opposite. Soldiers grew weary, bled, and died in staggering numbers, but they never felt abandoned. A Marine crouching in the mud of Sugar Loaf Hill might be covered in filth and fear, but when the night fell, he could hear the distant rumble of trucks. That sound meant more ammunition, more food, and more bandages. It meant survival. The convoys were not only arteries of supply, they were arteries of morale. Commanders exploited this difference. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, leading the U.S. 10th Army, knew that attrition would grind the Japanese down. He could afford to lose men, terrible as the price was, because his supply lines never faltered. Japanese General Mitsuru Ushijima knew the opposite. Every casualty was irreplaceable. Every shell expended one step closer to silence. His soldiers fought with fanatical courage, but courage could not conjure bullets from empty crates. The impact reached deeper still. In after-action reports, American officers noted the visible collapse of enemy cohesion once convoys began rolling in force. Japanese ambushes grew fewer, artillery fire slackened, and desertions among conscripted Okinawans increased. The island's civilians, realizing which side could sustain itself, quietly shifted their hopes for survival toward the invader. Some even approached American convoys at great personal risk, begging for food. Drivers sometimes tossed rations from truck beds, a small gesture that carried immense symbolic weight. Here was an enemy who could spare supplies, while their supposed protectors demanded their last grains of rice. The psychological toll on Japanese command was devastating. Reports to Tokyo grew bleak, describing an enemy that seemed impervious to exhaustion. One commander compared the Americans to a giant with endless lungs, breathing life into their soldiers while his own suffocated. Another lamented that while his men were willing to die, their deaths no longer had meaning. They could not halt the flow of convoys to BY June. The defenders understood what the civilians had already grasped. The trucks symbolized inevitability. Okinawa was not a question of if, but when. The endless supply lines told everyone on the island, soldiers, civilians, even American troops themselves, that the outcome had been decided before the first shot was fired. The Japanese had gambled that sacrifice could outweigh supply. On Okinawa's roads, they discovered the opposite truth. Supply could drown sacrifice. The island itself seemed to echo this shift. Rice paddies became staging grounds. Orchards turned into depots. Hillsides scarred by bombardment sprouted convoys instead of trees. To the people of Okinawa, the landscape of their home was remade, and with it, their understanding of war. War was not only courage or carnage, it was logistics, engines, and trucks that in the end, the psychological battlefield was as decisive as the physical. The Americans did not only break through the Shuri line with artillery and infantry, they broke through with the constant assurance of supply. The Japanese did not only collapse under bombardment, they collapsed under the unbearable knowledge that their enemy could fight forever, while they could fight only until their last bullet, their last grain of rice. The battle for Okinawa ended in June 1945, but its legacy thundered far beyond the coral ridges and shattered villages of the island. In the wreckage of war, among the burned fields and broken homes, one truth stood unmistakable. America's mastery of logistics had crushed an empire. The trucks that filled Okinawa's roads were not just vehicles. They were symbols of a new age of warfare, where victory belonged not only to the brave, but also to the supplied. Japanese officers who survived the carnage admitted it in their post-war testimonies. They spoke of courage squandered against an enemy whose strength multiplied with every passing day. General Ushijima, before his ritual suicide, acknowledged the grim arithmetic. Japan had spirit, but America had endurance. And endurance had prevailed. The defenders had fought with skill and honor, but their isolation had doomed them from the start. No army, no matter how determined, could withstand an enemy that arrived with factories in motion. The civilians of Okinawa never forgot. For years afterward, they recalled the endless convoys, the headlights streaming across the hillsides, and the rumble of engines that shook their homes. Many spoke of that sound as the very definition of America: ceaseless, powerful, unstoppable. It was a memory burned as deeply as the bomb craters that still pocked their fields. Historians would later draw the same conclusion. The Second World War was a conflict of tanks, planes, and ships, but beneath them all ran the quiet power of logistics. In Europe, the Red Ball Express had driven victory across France. In the Pacific, on islands like Guadalcanal, Leyte, and finally Okinawa, the convoys of trucks ensured that American soldiers fought with full bellies and loaded rifles. Germany had its panzers, Japan its Zeros. But America had its factories and its trucks, and those won the war. The lessons carried forward into the Cold War. Generals studying the ruins of Okinawa understood that the next conflict would demand not only firepower but also networks of supply, of communication, and of coordination. Radios, once dismissed as fragile luxuries, became standard in every armored vehicle. Trucks evolved into supply chains on wheels, capable of feeding mechanized divisions across continents. The doctrine of network-centric warfare, connecting every soldier, every machine, every unit, traced its roots to the lessons of 1945, when Okinawa's roads filled with American convoys. Modern wars, too, bore the echo. In the Gulf War of 1991, American forces once again unleashed a logistical tidal wave. Convoys stretched across deserts, feeding divisions that moved with lightning speed. Satellites and digital radios replaced the SCR-508s of the 1940s, but the principle was the same. An army that is connected and supplied is an army that cannot be stopped. In Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in countless operations since, the lineage of those olive-drab trucks can be traced in every resupply convoy, every logistics hub, and every fuel line stretching toward the front. For the veterans of Okinawa, the memory was bittersweet. They remembered the friends they lost in the mud of Sugar Loaf Hill, the screams in the caves of Shuri, and the endless rain of kamikazes upon the fleet. Yet they also remembered the trucks, the lifelines that carried food when they were starving, ammunition when their rifles clicked empty, and plasma when their wounds threatened to end them. To them, the trucks were not faceless machines. They were saviors, silent comrades that bore them through hell. And for the Japanese survivors, the lesson was harsher still. Their empire had been built on the myth that spirit outweighed steel. On Okinawa, that myth had been buried beneath the wheels of 1,000 convoys. The civilians saw it clearly. No matter how bravely Japan fought, it could not match a nation that turned every factory, every worker, and every machine into part of its army. Spirit may inspire men to fight, but it cannot build a bridge across an ocean nor feed an army for months on end. Okinawa's legacy was thus more than military. It was philosophical. It taught the world that wars are won not simply by bravery, but by connection between factories and front lines, between planners and soldiers, between trucks that rumble in the rear and rifles that fire in the front. It was a truth as cold as steel, as relentless as an engine's growl. When the war ended and Japan surrendered, American convoys did not stop. They carried relief supplies to starving civilians, rebuilt roads, and distributed medicine. Trucks that once hauled death now carried life. And for many Okinawans, the sight of those same olive-drab vehicles delivering food instead of ammunition was a strange comfort. The machines that had symbolized conquest now symbolized survival. In the end, the story of Okinawa is the story of logistics. It is the story of an empire that believed sacrifice could outweigh supply and of a nation that proved otherwise. It is the story of civilians who could not believe the endless convoys they saw, and of soldiers who placed their faith in the machines that carried them through fire. It is the story of modern war itself, where power lies not only in the gun but also in the truck that carries the bullets. The roads of Okinawa, once quiet paths through rice paddies and villages, became highways of history. Upon them rolled not only trucks but also the future of warfare. Their lesson endures still. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, endurance defeats spirit, and the rumble of engines is the sound of victory.